and found myself later to be a scholar of Islamic thought at University of Cape Town first, where I did my training and got my PhD from there, and then taught as a visiting professor at Stanford, tenured at Duke, and now at Notre Dame. These two universes, in some ways, and these two worlds, do not sit comfortably together. But I have come to believe that the discomfort itself is productive. That living at the threshold between the tradition that I live and practice, and that is very important for me, the Islamic tradition, its intellectual history, the Islamic civilization, and the secular universities in which I was also trained, it forms for me the threshold, what I call in my book on Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination, the dehliz, that in-between space between the house, the door to the house, then you get the courtyard, and then the door to the outside. I do not see it as a problem to be resolved, but rather as a tension space from where critique becomes possible. The madrasa tradition grounds intellectual authority in lineage, in lines of authority, that cultivates your capacity to reason within and against a living tradition. Knowledge has a telos, it's oriented towards wisdom, toward human flourishing, toward what we call in Islamic terms, the realization of ihsan. And ihsan normally means, what people say is distinction or perfection, but I believe that the fountain of ihsan is the ability to do good, but doing good requires the question of character. Character is fundamental to the practice of ihsan. It is not produced for its own sake, certainly not for institutional prestige or for citation metrics. The modern university operates fundamentally on a different logic. It rewards novelty, rewards distinction, and a kind of credentialed innovation that, say, someone like Bordeaux would recognize as the self-production of an academic field. The teacher-student relationship in the university, in most occasions, except for your graduate students, you have a different kind of relationship, but largely it is transactional. And especially at the undergraduate level in American universities, it's a nightmare. Knowledge in the universities loses its formative dimension and, crucially, its ethical accountability, but you can't push the boundaries with your students as I do and tell them things that no one else tells them in the other classes that they take. I'm also not romanticizing the madrasa. Madrasa has its own pathologies, the reproduction of sometimes narrow authority, the marginalization of women as knowledge producers, the failure in many instances to engage questions of contemporary relevance, rather, instead of critically, they do so defensively, and so on. What I want to propose is that decolonial education requires both the formation that the madrasa tradition at its best provides and the creative, questioning, horizon-expanding energy that universities at its best are known for. My last comments will be on the kind of the structural logic of the Western episteme. Colonial knowledge, and I've been a subject of colonial knowledge back in South Africa under apartheid, and I think we're still living under colonial authority in different guises, at its structural core does not see the other. That's what I think, if you want to understand, despite all the stuff that post-colonialism and deconstruction has talked about the other means very different things to people like Derrida or even Foucault and so on. This means the other within a Westocentric universe, but they do not see the other that is me and many of you here. It does not recognize the knowledge forms and life forms of those it has displaced and dominated. Its horizon closing. It celebrates Western and mostly Western man, the achievements of the West, and most damagingly, it configures no alternative to itself. But I want to go deeper than this. The Western episteme is not merely self-congratulatory. Its underlying grammar is one of war and competition, of elimination rather than rehabilitation. It is organized around conquest of nature, of other peoples, of previous paradigms. Progress in this frame means displacement and disposal. The old is discarded, the previous era's products rendered obsolete, value extracted from one generation of goods and knowledge and then abandoned in favor of the next. The Islamic intellectual tradition, and I speak from within it, operates by a different knowledge, by a different logic. It is a tradition of bricolage, of things that you add together, of rehabilitation and reuse and remaking. Islamic civilization builds on other formations of knowledge, from the knowledge of the Arabian prophet to the legacies of the Greeks, the Indians, and everybody else, and the Persians in particular. And that's how it develops. Innovation is driven by need, not by market logic of perpetual novelty. You build on what has come before you. You do not dispose of it unless it is no longer usable. And the great classical scholars like Al-Ghazali, Fakhr al-Razi, Ibn Rushd were not demolishing their predecessors. They were in conversation with them across centuries. The text was a living interlocutor, not a relic to be superseded. I think I will stop there and talk again when I get the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Now, a lot of the things that Professor Musa has mentioned just now begs the crucial question. We still exist in the very systems that were set up by the colonial powers. The Dutch, the British, the Spanish, the Americans especially, had imposed a certain structure, certain philosophies, and certain pedagogies that we still use in the universities. Now I want to turn to Professor Nadia. To what extent then do colonial legacies continue to shape present-day educational systems, especially in the universities? And how can we academics and also our students move beyond symbolic gestures towards decolonial pedagogies and curriculum? And is it at all possible for us to move beyond it, as what Professor Musa mentioned just now? How can we then merge these different traditions that we have inherited with the current realities that we are in?
There are 4 things that people think are fundamental to universities and colleges and institutions of higher education. And those 4 things are content, lecture, exam, and grades. But people don't know where those came from. Those came from a system of warehousing hundreds of small children, initially boys, in Britain and in France, and then later in India, South Africa, and where I'm from, Canada, Turtle Island. And in that system, you could not keep the boys quiet. They were teaching them languages that were no longer used, ancient Greek and Latin. They were teaching them skills that were no longer used, and the boys knew it, and they could rebel. They could have a small boys' revolution in these schools. So how did they keep them in line? Well, they lectured at them, and they beat them. And then it became controversial, because it's not good policy in a school to kill your boys or your girls. So they had to invent something that would settle down the boys and the girls without murdering them. So they came up with competition and examinations, and some boys being given control and made more senior over other boys. And this history is well known. You can read about it or watch the films made from the stories of Charles Dickens. And there are many stories from those years, from the 1500s to the 1800s, and frankly, continuing until the present. Those schools still exist, and they birthed universities. and those methods of competition and examinations continue, but very few people question their history. But if we were to question and to dare to challenge content, lecture, exam, and grade, what would happen? Well, I ask you now to begin a small process that would change those systems. And I want you to look in a moment, not yet, to your left and smile at that person, and inside, without speaking, I want you to wish them well. And then I want you to turn to your right and smile at that person, and inside you, without a word, to wish them well. So let's turn to our left, and let's turn to our right. And that is the beginning of learning from one another, learning through relationships. That is the beginning of all of us in this room having every single person in this room as a teacher, and all of us in this room being a teacher. And that is the first step to decolonizing our pedagogies and our institutions. Because if we can see one another as equals, then the suggestion that comes from a first-year undergraduate student is one that is taken up by the institution and made into a project that continues even after that student is no longer at that institution. Imagine the creativity and what we could build if everyone in every institution were given the power to create together. Imagine if instead of all of us having to conform to the same norm of studying for examinations and passing them with a certain number, imagine instead if you could just be you. What if you play piano? How much does that matter in a course on sociology? But what if it did? What if you're a champion boxer? And how can you bring that into your chemistry class? But what if you could? What if you could bring your talents and your strengths and be accepted for having those, and not asked to conform to the very few skills that someone like me as a professor in a university is able to bring about? We're trained as professors to teach students to read, to write, to speak, and not much more. In fact, there's not much more I could train you in, by the way. But students in the class can train the rest of the class in so much more than reading and writing and speaking. So let's give that platform to everyone in the institutions. Let the decision-making be collective and be from everyone. Who is the expert in mental health, if not the people who are facing mental health challenges? Who is the expert in youth, if not the youth? Instead of content, we can have a circle. We all learn from one another, and we all create. Instead of lecture, we can have experiences together. We can visit museums, art galleries, other countries. We can learn languages immersed in the language. We can learn arts. We can learn sports. We can learn what we're not good at because we're not punished for not being good. Instead of exams, we can have project-based learning. We can have initiatives created by people who know what they're doing because they're given the opportunity to work in an area that they care about. We can have case-based learning. That's in medical schools already. They say it's the best kind. And instead of grades, we can have portfolios, things that you develop and offer to the world. One of the speakers earlier today said that we cannot decolonize universities, but that until the day when universities cease to exist and are replaced by better forms of learning, there are things we need to do inside of them. I come from a land where the universities are built on stolen land, where the universities are named after slave traders and slave owners, where the universities are named after people who instituted a system of imprisoning and harming children. We cannot decolonize a university like mine, built on stolen land, with the funds amassed by imprisoning children. That must be dismantled. But we can center every Indigenous person in that institution. We can have Indigenous people lead the institution. At the moment, out of something like over 1,000 professors, 900 tenure track, and thousands more who are precariously employed, I can count on my 2 hands and my fingers the number of professors who are Indigenous. That must change and can change. I'm known as one of the very, very few Palestinian women with a tenure track position. Those kinds of things can change. But it's not only about changing the people in the positions. Decolonization is about ultimately making everyone know that they belong. It is about relinquishing the power to have a flat power structure, not a hierarchical one. And above all, these things are possible, and each one of us, in our own way, can make them possible. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Now, that is decolonization. I think the big point that we are going to get from that is about how to remove hierarchies that have developed in the universities, hierarchies that we have inherited from the colonial powers, from colonial structures. Now, I'm going to bring all of us closer to home, to Turkey. And I don't have the privilege to talk about Turkey, but I'm going to hand over to Professor Halil. Now, based on your experience, Professor Halil, in Turkish universities, what place should critics of colonialism have within university teaching and research? And how then can we talk about what Nadia and Ibrahim was talking about just now? How can we actually change the manner to which we teach? How can we make our teaching more relational, less hierarchical, more informational, less grade conscious? How can all of these decolonial so-called ideals be implemented in Turkish universities, Prof?
I have 10 hours, right?
Not 10 hours, you got 10 minutes.
Thank you. Can I stand up? Am I allowed to stand up?
Because you can see it there also.
All right, yes. I can see what I want to say from over there. Okay. So my title says already a lot about what I want to talk about: the Ottoman Empire's peripheral but non-colonial trajectory. This is crucial. The late Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey today are examples of not post-colonial societies and cultures, including education, but what we might call post-imperial cultures and societies, including education. I will be limiting my remarks basically to the field of the discipline of history and history education in Turkey, both at the secondary and the higher education levels. The history education that we have is not really the existing system, the existing curriculum. Our textbooks, our modalities of teaching are not really post-colonial in any way, but part of a long post-imperial tradition. The history that is taught in the primary school level, the secondary school level, in university history departments, and even at the MA and PhD level is basically 19th century style, I would say Rankian and Treitschkian kind of national history, imposed upon and integrated into an imperial tradition. This is basically because the Ottoman Empire was never a colony. in terms of, let's think of the typical 19th century gaze of European elites turned on the rest of the world. We can basically speak of three categories or three concentric belts, if you want. There is the core, what Hegel called the historical nations. That's to say, nations supposedly with history as progress and development. Out in the third belt, you have the people without history, or shall we say more simply, the primitives, that are regarded as fair game for colonization and the civilizing mission of colonization. In between, you have what were called the high civilizations. That is to say, China, Mughal India, in a vague sense, maybe all of Islamic civilization and Islamdom, Persia and the Ottoman Empire, and maybe also Ethiopia, Abyssinia as it was called at that time in Africa. So what we are talking about is a handful of state societies, not tribal or quasi-tribal societies, but state societies with a well-developed bureaucracy and army, including Marshal Hodgson's gunpowder empires, the Safavids, the Mughals, and the Ottomans. And therefore, at some early stage of their development, having ended up conquering large territories, large enough that they take a long time to lose in the face of rising European modernity. That is to say, it becomes to a huge extent a question of trading space for time. Defeat, retreat, loss of a province, 20 years gained. Defeat, retreat, loss of another province, and some more decades gained. Gained for what? Gained for what? Gained in order to be able to launch their own, from the top-down modernization movement, precisely because they are capable of doing this, having preserved a modicum of political independence and state sovereignty right down to the end. So we have these 19th century, what are known as the Tanzimat era, military and bureaucratic and educational reforms in the Ottoman Empire, which are really a matter of not just achieving, not just in real practical material terms, succeeding in catching up with Western modernity, but they also contain a very important dimension of self-representation. That is to say, to what extent can we represent ourselves as already Western so that we can then gain admission into the concert of Europe from the middle into the second half of the 19th century. You see, being in the second belt is intrinsically unstable and fragile. It is like being in the second division of a nationwide football system, whereby the prospects you face are either relegation into the third division, or if you want to be able to permanently prevent relegation, to succeed in achieving promotion into the first division. I could say that this is also like being in purgatory, being in Araf. And the two exits are either into the hell of colonization or into the heaven of the Premier League, the first division. And once you get there, you will be safe, because the idea is these predatory Europeans will not predate on their own kind. So if you make it into the first division or the first league, so the Ottomans believed in the 19th century, because what had happened was, in the course of their own modernization efforts and their complex love and hate relationship with the West, they did not just import hardware, they also imported software, including this whole construct, which means that we are facing a case of internalized, imported and internalized Eurocentrism in a non-colonial, peripheral, but non-colonial kind of context. It has manifold ramifications in social and economic terms. There is no colonial economy. There is no colonial economy, there is no massive extractive sector, there is no significant foreign investment in mines or plantations or factories, etc., because there is not that kind of safety for foreign investment that is possible only in a colonial context. A second dimension is what is again possible in colonial situations, that is to say, the exercise of extra economic force to coercively break up whatever pre-capitalist modes of production there might be. That is not possible. The Ottoman peasantry, they continue as a small producing peasantry right down to the end, because the expropriation of this peasantry of the sort or with the mechanisms that are available in colonial situations is simply not possible. It also gives rise to the Ottoman regime being able to set up its own military bureaucratic schools from the early 19th century onward in order to create a new army. And of course, how that comes to manifest itself is Turkey's national struggle of 1919-1922, which is really not a national liberation struggle against colonialism. Instead, it is a struggle to defend, repair, and redefine an already existing independence. It is not a 20th century type anti-colonial national liberation war in any sense of the world. What this does is it also leads into an educational system in which the two critical courses, disciplines, lessons of one, literature, and two, history. Critical for what? Critical for self-definition, critical for identity. These two key ideological courses already in the second half of the 19th century, in the first military schools that are established, come to be devoted entirely to an imperial and national kind of history on the basis of the enormous collections of Ottoman histories and chronicles from the 14th century onward, including the earliest chronicles by Aşık Paşazade and others, a wealth of narrative sources, imperially oriented narrative sources, which are again the mark of a state society from a very early date onwards. So we are not talking about the Ottoman case, the late Ottoman and modern Turkish case cannot possibly be fitted into Hegel's cliché about people without history.
Professor
There
Halil,
is an enormous history.
I'm really sorry to stop you. Can you wrap it up?
Okay, I will stop there. What happens is the entire legacy of Ottoman history and Ottoman court literature as well as folk literature is poured into these ideologically sensitive two courses from the second half of the 19th century onward, and it further continues into the Republican era. So if something is bad or narrow or stereotyped or cliched about Turkish education in these subjects, it is not a matter of colonialism, it is a matter of this 19th century style, imperial and national history.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I think that's a very powerful point. And I think the big point that Professor Halil is trying to underline here is what he calls as internalized Eurocentrism, that in the end, when we look at Turkish educational systems, I know he's trying to be nice and gentle and only talk about history and literature, but I think the entire system, as he's trying to suggest here, is essentially Eurocentric. Now, we can go further to say that it is actually quite American-centric. And this is where Joseph Massad comes in. I mean, I had the liberty to read all of his books. I've not missed anyone. He has another 1,500-page book coming up. But I want to kind of probe this whole issue of internalized Eurocentrism and internalized American centrism. Now, in your own experience, Joseph, being in the belly of the beast, how do you assess academic freedom, as the Americans like to say, in the American university today? And do all of this talk about freedom, do they actually exist in the American academe?
Thank you very much. I'm afraid even as a student in the United States, I had a collision with this notion of academic freedom and with the suppression of inquiries that I had made of professors. At one point when I was a master's student, I was kicked out of a class, of a seminar, by a so-called leftist professor. It was a Latin American sort of seminar. I used to study Latin America as a master's student. And I had to basically beg to be let in order to graduate. I was graduating that semester. And I had to go and say, oh, I'm sorry, this is not ideological. I just was really inquiring. It was an actual question. But the intolerance, especially the more liberal a professor is, the more intolerant they are, usually. So in that sense, it was quite an eye-opener if I had had any illusions about the US as a young kid going there at the age of 18. So I had encountered several of these. But what is interesting about academic freedom in the United States, or in the Western Academy more generally, in the US we begin to see increasingly, of course, the repression of the McCarthyist period in the 1950s against communists or those accused of being communists. We begin to see more repression again in the 1960s against those who protested the Vietnam War. But also, I mean, there's always been this anti-Semitic discourse of civility. This begins in the beginning of the 20th century, targeting Jewish immigrant academics or Jewish academics in the United States, calling their ways of inquiring about the nature of education, the state, or the science as uncivil. So what is interesting and ironic, of course, is that this incivility begins to be a major accusation leveled at those who are critical of the state of Israel and who support the rights of the Palestinians, especially since the 2000s. But something interesting had happened, in between 1948 and the late 1970s. There was very little published academically about the Palestinian plight in the US Academy. There had been a number of books published by journalists, some by scholars collecting documents about the 1948 war, for example, but there was very little space to discuss the Palestinian narrative of what had happened to them and what had befallen them in 1948, what the Palestinians came to call the Nakba. Suddenly, in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, the Israeli government and military archives were opened, and some conservative, some liberal Israeli Zionist scholars, not really known for pro-Palestinian positions, went and delved into these archives and began to publish books in the late 80s, which confirmed, perhaps even shed more light and provided so much more detail from the Israeli official perspective on what had befallen the Palestinians in 1948, the dozens of massacres, the expulsion. Suddenly, the white liberal academy could no longer say that the Palestinians made up these stories. All the Palestinian books that were published in Arabic or in English that spoke of the massacres, of the expulsion, suddenly now had a confirmation through this Israeli scholarship. And the Israeli scholars were mostly Ashkenazi European scholars, and therefore were believable to white American liberals, Jewish or Christian, given the Eurocentrism and the intrinsic institutional racism of who gets to have credibility and who does not in a white supremacist society like the settler colony of the United States. So what you begin to see is a rise of scholarship on Palestine in the 80s and 90s. There was a small attempt made by Edward Said in 1979 when he published The Question of Palestine. It was a trade book for a general audience, and even though it was written in a sort of a high academic caliber, it really reached the literati of American society less so, and had less of an effect on Middle East studies, say, or any area specialists. A lot of this would change, and would change measurably in the 1990s. With the rise of more scholars, sort of beginning to delve into Palestinian politics. Of course, there had been a number of interesting studies earlier, but they did not have the kind of attention that these new studies had. But still, many of those, especially white American scholars, liberal scholars, who would begin to write, would begin to say, they would speak from both sides of their mouth, but the Israelis have, rights and this, and the Palestinians. So suddenly the Palestinians, who are not this, horrible population. The Palestinians, of course, in Western racist discourse, had been dismissed and forgotten as refugees between 1948 and 1965. Following the rise of the Palestinian guerrilla movement, suddenly the Palestinians went from dismissible refugees into horrific terrorists who hijacked planes. I should note, of course, that the Israelis were the first to ever hijack civilian planes in the Middle East and introduced the practice back in 1951 when they hijacked, when they shot at a civilian airliner, killing an Arab Jewish student and injuring 7 passengers at the time. A little girl child had her leg amputated. There'd be many more hijackings of planes over the years and downing of civilian airliners. Nonetheless, the Palestinians suddenly became a terrorist group until sort of the early 80s. The first televised massacres of the Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila in 1982 sort of began to show the Palestinians as kind of also victims. So they're terrorists and victims. You begin to see some ambivalence, even in the mainstream white-owned and run media, about the Palestinians. This was perhaps, this increased during the first Palestinian uprising or intifada in 1987 onwards. And this sort of has remained sort of the status of Palestinians between terrorists and possible victims. Rest assured, even with the massive movement today that opposes Israeli genocide and shows solidarity with the Palestinians as victims, most of those who are against Israeli genocide only support Palestinians as victims. They do not support the Palestinian right to resist their oppressors. People sometimes get confused and mistake those who oppose the genocide and support the Palestinians as victims of genocide as possibly supporters of Palestinian resistance. That is utterly untrue. And the majority of those today in the West who march against the Israeli genocide and for Palestinian rights do not support the Palestinian right to actually resist. So what ended up happening in the academy, and this is very important, from the 90s onwards, is the rise of archival-based scholarship from Israeli archives, from the American archives, that increased our knowledge and confirmed the Palestinian narrative that had gone on since 1948. However, it had very little impact on the media. The media understanding of the Palestinians remained the same. There was a slight change. Suddenly, the New York Times began to say that the Palestinians in 1948 who fled or were expelled. It was no longer who fled, suddenly fled or who were expelled. But of course, that also came at the same time as the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967 were no longer actually referred to as occupied. They came to be known as disputed territories in the New York Times lingo. But generally, there was a huge accumulation now of knowledge, academic knowledge about the Palestinians, what Israel had visited on them and continues to visit on them, that seemed to be not only unknown in the media, or the media remained reticent to it, but also across the academy, unless you are within sort of Middle East studies and the humanities and the social sciences, most of the information you had as an academic, let alone as a university administrator, about the history of the Palestinians continued to be derived from the mainstream media. So even like, the university operatives at my own university think what they know about the Palestinian question, they know from the New York Times, not from their own academics, because they don't read our scholarship, right? So if you're also a political scientist who's a specialist, say, in Latin America or in the United States, the only thing you would know about the Palestinians comes from the New York Times. So the level of bias for the pro-Israeli, pro-genocidal, pro-settler colonial view of the world is rampant across the general public and across academia. But suddenly after 9/11, something changed. After 9/11, the pro-Israeli camp and the pro-Israel lobby in the United States realized that the academy had changed considerably, and there had risen a huge gap between academic knowledge and media knowledge of the Palestinians and the Israelis, and therefore even young students who graduate from high schools, learned high schools, and come to our university suddenly are shocked to hear a different kind of history about Palestine and the Middle East, and began to complain to their wealthy parents, who complained to the universities, who complained to donors, and suddenly everything began to change. A major attack on the universities in 2002, a right-wing pro-Israel group called Campus Watch began to put public dossiers. Yours truly was one of the 8 sort of faculty that was targeted. And from then on, the attempt to bring down the university so that knowledge production in the university should match that of the media, that it could not and should not be able to question it. So as a result, now and after October 2023, the university administrators came to understand and be convinced by the media and the government and political power that indeed they must discipline their own faculty, so that the production of knowledge that they actually issue and that they propagate should be in line with what the media and the US government thinks is actually the right kind of knowledge, the truth of political propaganda. So this is sort of where we are today.
Very nice. And I think that sums it up. I think academic freedom, as Professor Massad is trying to suggest, has always been breached, partly by the universities themselves. But I think we are in a social media world, and things are changing, not only in America, I think in the rest of the world as well. More voices are coming out. So we don't have much time. We have 3 minutes and 26 seconds. I'm going to open up for anyone who has a question to ask here, please. There's 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's take 3, and then we'll roll it with the lady over there. Louder a bit.
Am I supposed to hear?
Louder, maybe a bit louder.
Is there no microphone?
I can't
Okay.
hear anything.
Thank you. My question is to Ustad Masoud about traditional, I think I didn't make mistake. It's Musa. Sorry, I'm so sorry. It's about madrasa and moral tradition, which is based on, or leads to wisdom and ihsan, doing good, and the difference, which is different from secular tradition, education tradition. We see that secular tradition now is facing a big problem, which is paper mills, there is a big problem with retracting paper, what we are witnessing nowadays, or even this time. I have a question about what about reviving some Islamic moral tradition. I'm thinking about the paradigm of Taha Abdurrahman I'timan, which shifts knowledge from knowledge as certificate product to knowledge as moral responsibility. So I'm thinking about it's kind of decolonizing how we think about knowledge and knowledge production. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take the next one. Yes, the brother in, yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I don't know, is it a question or a comment for everybody?
You have to just
stage?
ask a question.
Yes.
No comments, please. Thank you.
It's a comment which raised to a question.
Okay.
We were talking about decolonization in the university in education. Before that, we speak about decolonization of the vocabulary. I want to go to a deeper level. I want to talk about decolonization of the language. So, when I walk around at Üsküdar, going to Isam library, I saw these students going out from Üsküdar University. They are from many backgrounds, Arabs, Asians, Malaysians. When they speak to each other in their own language, they're just like whispering. It's just like they're ashamed. But when they speak in English, they speak with a loud voice, and they're twisting their tongues to make it more American. It's like if they're proud of speaking in English. My mother used to come to visit me at the summer, and when my neighbor says to her merhaba in Turkish, she responds hi. I said to my mother, he's saying merhaba, it's an Arabic word. Why don't you say merhaba? We are always assisting to speak in English. When I was wandering around schools to register my son...
Sorry, brother, I think we got your point. Can you ask the question?
Yeah, the question is English now, it's an ironic question, is English now the language of God? And I don't want to offend any English speaker, but we came to the position to have a good education, we have to teach English. So the schools, to advertise themselves, they show you how much good we are at teaching English. That's my question.
Okay, it's open for everyone. The brother in blue. So you raise your hand. Yeah. Yes.
Assalamualaikum Hojam. This question goes to Halil Hoja. I saw in the slides just now that you talk about the ways of writing about the world history that are quite different. You name a couple of scholars and historians, and you were, I think, about to suggest there's a different way of thinking about, try to include more stories. So maybe you can elaborate on that point. I think you didn't get the time to sort of talk about that. So I wanted to ask, in terms of writing world history, as you are mentioning in your presentation, what are the ways of writing the world history that are less, well, out of the typical Eurocentric framework, if you like?
All right. Let's begin first. Shall we take one more question? Is that all right? Yes.
Sorry?
Can we take one more question? Is that okay for everyone? Okay, let's take one more.
Simply
well,
did
can
not
I?
understand
We had
what
two.
was said.
Sorry, excuse me. We had two men asking the question. Can you give it to a lady? Is that okay? Because I'm very pro women here. Can we get it from that lady behind? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Am I the lady? Okay. This is just a quick question. I had the impression from the Professor Halil Berktay's presentation that this very empirically and correct that Turkey is not colonized de facto and so on, and the capitalist structures and not extracted and so. But are we not really integrated the racial capitalist structures, global racial capitalist structures? And is the knowledge and higher education problem is not just the problem of colonization, but the problem of coloniality that is basically based on this philosophy of history that some people are without history and some people are at some stage stagnated historically here, and some are the perfection of the history. This Hegelian, he also himself said that the cliche, this philosophy of history and then temporalization of the people and the world. And I think this goes for all.
It's an excellent question.
Thank you very much.
You're asking Professor Halil, but the question is actually for Professor Massad.
For everyone.
Yeah, so
thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So let's begin first with Professor Musa. We want to respond to the lady on the madrasa.
Thank you. I think the questioner is right. One of the big things that people working at education, especially looking at multiple traditions and those who are looking back at the Islamic tradition, are thinking more in terms of what are the kind of epistemic virtues that were prevalent in the past that we have lost, and even the madrasas have lost, like the idea of humility, the question of curiosity, the question of compassion. Those are epistemic virtues that the tradition valued, and I think through kind of, the post-McIntyrean turn, especially amongst Muslims living in the West, and the turn to tradition, there's been a rethink about the issues, and Taha Abdul Rahman is one of those people who've been talking about the trusteeship paradigm, to see knowledge as a trust and utilize it as a trust. So I think you are onto something when you raise that issue, and I think that's worthy of exploring. But I think there's something else that, as we are thinking about, decolonial education and decolonizing education, bringing in those various, capacities that we need in order to be fully human and not only be competitive, we are also faced with a major crisis. It's an existential one. There are powers in this region who are threatening major Muslim countries with extinction. And you cannot, and this is the dilemma for decolonial education, that you will have to develop the tools in order to defend yourself. And that is a question that it cannot just be, that it will be, decolonial education will be more compassion, which is necessary, but we shouldn't lose sight of the real existential conditions that many people around the world are facing, but especially in this part of the world. And if you know, the first quarter of the 21st century, millions of people in 7 Muslim countries have been impacted by colonial actions. And some of them with the consent of Muslim majority states that became instruments of that colonial attacks on millions of people's lives. So that's a dilemma that we need to think through as to how do we, coordinate and think through questions of education, that we also develop capacity and power to repel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The question on English, maybe Nadia, you can respond to it. Yep.
I think people who speak dominant languages have an obligation to learn languages that are not as dominant. I only know the alphabet in sign, which means that a deaf person can speak to me in their language, but I will only understand if they spell things out. So I have an obligation to learn sign. If we want indigenous languages to survive and to thrive, not only the people who are indigenous must learn them. My children should learn them too. Why not? I think that language is beautiful. Languages are also different, and there are words in one language that you won't find in another. And we need to ensure that no language dies, and that no language is repressed simply for being different from what all the people around that speak. So I agree with you. I think that language is really important. And whatever we can do in our lives to ensure we have multiple languages all around us and that everyone has the rights to their languages, I hope that we can continue to do that. And I'm grateful for the translation today, to the interpreters in the room. Thank you for what you're doing. I'd like to add one very quick last point as the last word that I won't say anything after that. And thank you for all of the questions, particularly on knowledge as moral responsibility and every people having a history. I want to add to what Professor Musa said, which is that it sounds like a luxury to decolonize education, but in fact it's an urgency. If Canada were not a colony, it would not have the capacity to repress the Indigenous people who are part of, who are sovereign in Turtle Island. And it would also not have the capacity, the collective acknowledgement and complicity to fuel harm and violence and war and genocide elsewhere. Canada is part of an ongoing genocide against First Nations, which enables and allows it to be part of ongoing genocides elsewhere. Canada prides itself as fighting genocide, as being part of the court case against genocide against the Rohingya. But Canada is complicit in genocide, not only in Turtle Island, but also in Palestine, possibly in Sudan. We need to decolonize education because our capacity to act democratically is built on our skill set to work collectively. If we don't have that skill set, and I made it simple, smile to your left, smile to your right, but it's actually very difficult to work as one, to stop the things that are happening, that are harming in today's world. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. So what we need to do is to recultivate those talents and those skills so that we can work together rather than compete against one another, rather than feel belittled in our educational systems. We need to see everyone flourish. Remember, some of the greatest people to influence history and change the course of the world for the better were among the most marginalized, whether for disability, whether for ascribed race, whether for whatever purpose. Those were often the change makers. We need to make our institutions places where everyone can belong so that everyone can make change together.
Thank you, Nadia.
May I add a postscript to this?
Yes. Prof, we are running, we are racing against time.
A quick postscript just to say that English is not a neutral language, it's a colonial language. So therefore, I grew up in a colonial world. I learned the colonial languages. I learned English and French and Spanish and Italian and my native Arabic. But had I lived up to World War I, my languages would have been Arabic, Turkish, and Persian in our region. That in our region, these are the three languages of intellectual life. However, learning English or French is part of the colonial languages and domination. These are not coincidental. And it changes intellectual life, it changes libraries, it changes print culture. So all of this has to be factored in. And of course, the question of self-hatred and the feeling proud that you speak English. And as an Arab comedian once said, imagine in the West, even small children speak English. It's not an achievement, you see.
Okay, Professor Halil, I'll give you the last word. We have like 1 minute to respond to one of the questions on history.
I have a problem. Because of my hearing difficulties, compounded by the echo in this room,
right.
The only thing that I have understood is that there are certain questions addressed to me. I'm sorry, but I don't have any sense of what the questions were about.
Yeah, so maybe
that's my physical problem, but if somebody could explain to me briefly what the questions were about.
Yes, Prof. So
I might try replying.
Yeah, if I can reframe the question for you. Is it at all possible for the history curriculum in Turkish universities to be at all decolonized? I think that's the big point there.
I have tried to explain first why the main problem is not decolonization. Point two, this does not mean that there are no elements that need to undergo decolonization. Let me show you something. May I have my, whoever is doing this, may I have my PowerPoint back? I want to show you two quotations. I have spoken of a three-belt 19th century Eurocentric view of the world. The first belt, the second belt, the third belt, and I've spoken of 19th century Ottoman elites and also Ittihatçıs and also Kemalists importing and internalizing this schema to the point where they perceive of themselves in terms of being in the second division and in purgatory. This brings with it a double attitude. Sometimes they sound like genuine and solid anti-colonialists. Sometimes they sound like they are part of the white European superior race looking in very condescending fashion on the primitives. And I would like to demonstrate this. But I need to be able to show two quotations. Will somebody help me with my...
Can they put it up again?
With my PowerPoint?
I think they can, Prof.
All right.
Yeah.
They can do it. They cannot. All right. I will quote from memory. Mehmed Akif. The Mehmed Akif. Author of Çanakkale Şehitlerine, Hymn to the Martyrs of Gallipoli, and author of the lyrics of the Turkish national anthem. In the Gallipoli hymn, in the beginning, he is talking about how a great alliance has been forged to attack Gallipoli, to attack Çanakkale, whatever. So he goes through the list. Together with Australia, there is Canada, and what is certain is they are all the same when it comes to savagery, hakikat, vahşetler, denk, etc. And then he comes to a line saying, kimi Hindu, kimi yamyam, kimi bilmem ne bela. Some are Hindus, some are cannibals, some I know not what scourge. What's he talking about? Hindus, the British Gurkha regiments that the British brought to Gallipoli. Who are cannibals? The Senegalese tirailleurs, the riflemen, the fusiliers that were part of the French army at Gallipoli. He calls them, some are Hindus, some cannibals. I would say in typical First Belt language. That is to say, at this point, he is adopting the language of imperialism and colonialism in talking about the poor colonial troops that were incorporated into the assault on Gallipoli without making any distinction between their masters and the colonial troops themselves. It is a prime example of not 2 + 3 against 1, not what would have been a great anti-imperialist united front against the imperialists, but 1 + 2, the first and second belts, adopting the same condescending attitude from the top down towards the primitives in the third belt.
Very Prof.
I can proliferate these examples. It goes... Yes?
One of the things that I think is important to point to is that you seem to hold today's Turkey as the same Turkey of the Ottoman Empire when you say that there was no colonization. As we know, of course, all the separatist movements and the Russian conquests of Ottoman territory colonized Ottoman subjects and killed about 6 million Muslims between 1820 and 1914 and created 5 million Ottoman refugees who came to what becomes Turkey. These 5 million actually had experienced colonialism, had experienced genocide and killing, and became part of Turkish society.
They experienced war and occupation. They did not have any long-term experience of colonial structuration. War and invasion and occupation are different from a situation where you have 20, 30, 50, 70 years of colonial rule and the comprehensive deprivation of the native people, the native society, from participation in politics, participation in military affairs, etc.
But colonial occupation has often been very, very short.
Okay, Professor Massad and Professor Halil.
I mean, if that is colonialism,
settler colonialism
the Nazi occupation of France would also be colonialism, and it is
I'm
not.
really sorry, Prof. Halil and Professor Massad. Thank you very much. We will continue this conversation over dinner. I think this is going to take about 8 hours of discussion. But please, let us thank our speakers for a very great session. Our universities need to be decolonized, and we will continue this conversation for the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another absolutely fascinating session. The professors, they bring you up intellectually, they challenge you, and then I bring you down. Because it takes a long time for empires to reconcile themselves with the fact that they've lost their territory. It takes empires even longer to rid themselves of their colonial mindset. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria were playing Hungary in a World Cup qualifier. The emperor was listening to the match on the radio, and he said to his assistant, "Hey, York, who is playing? Who is playing?" York said, "Emperor, sir, Austria is playing Hungary." And the emperor said, "Well, who are we playing?" Come on, you're two countries now. Get used to it. We'll have a very short break. Please come back just before 6 o'clock to hear another decolonial voice. Thank you so much.